My name is Nicholas Owen, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about antitrust laws. So I've provided two definitions for antitrust laws. One is from the textbook, and the other is from the Webster's website. So the textbook defines antitrust as the laws protecting commerce from unlawful restraints and anti-competitive practices. Um, Webster's legal definition for antitrust is legislation against or opposition to business trust or combinations, specifically consisting of laws to protect trade and commerce from unlawful restraints and monopolies or unfair business practices. So I'd like to point out that both of these definitions include the word or the phrase unlawful restraints apart from um, anti-competitive or unfair business practices. And so antitrust laws address monopolies, but they also address some of these unlawful restraints or unfair business practices that sometimes big businesses engage in. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we go through this. So what's the purpose of antitrust laws? To protect competition for the benefit of consumers, to ensure strong incentives for efficient business operation, to keep prices down, and to keep quality up. Federal antitrust laws address unlawful mergers and/or business practices and grant courts the power to decide which ones are illegal based on the unique facts of each case. So the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission or the courts have got to look at each situation on a case-by-case basis and determine whether or not a business or businesses are in violation of antitrust laws. Antitrust laws give the federal government the power to address certain types of unfair business practices by enforcing monetary penalties on companies or breaking them up. Competition among sellers gives consumers lower prices, higher quality products or services, more choice, and greater innovation. So we've seen this word monopoly pop up a few times. And a lot of times when people hear the word antitrust, they think of monopoly. So I want to take a second to kind of talk about what a monopoly is and how it affects the market. So again, I've provided two definitions. The textbook defines a monopoly as a market in which there is a single seller or a very limited number of sellers. And the Webster's legal definition defines monopoly as exclusive control over a particular market that is marked by the power to control prices and exclude competition, and that especially is developed willfully rather than as the result of superior product or skill. So monopolies are characterized by the absence of competition. They often lead to high cost for consumers, inferior products or services, or corrupt behavior. A company that dominates a particular business sector or industry has the ability to do a number of things that have a negative effect on the market or consumers in general. They can create artificial scarcities. So, for instance, let's say that a business, there was only one manufacturer for basketballs. So that manufacturer could come out and say, hey, there's a shortage on rubber, or there's a shortage on materials that we use to make these basketballs. And so we're going to use that as an excuse to up our prices. So they can fix prices and basically circumvent natural laws of supply and demand. And if you're taking this class, I'm sure you've had micro or macroeconomics. And so you know how the laws of supply and demand work. And basically monopolies are able to kind of, laws of supply and demand don't necessarily pertain to them. So they can also impede new entrants. Going back to the example for the basketball manufacturer, they can, a lot of times, big companies like that, they have the machinery and they buy so much material that they're able to manufacture, that basketball or whatever they're making at a much lower cost than would, a new competitor. So they can also inhibit experimentation and or new product development. A lot of times these companies are the people responsible for doing a lot of the experimentation or the new research for whatever product they make. And so, they might not be willing to, you know, improve upon a product, or come up with a product that might replace a product that they make, if it means less revenue. So monopolies are bad in general, but there's a few circumstances where a monopoly might be acceptable or even preferable. So, for example, utility companies. So sometimes a federal or local government might come out and say, hey, we're going to allow you to, have a monopoly over a particular area or a town. And the reason for this is, imagine if there were, multiple, electric companies, for instance, competing in a one area. There'd be utility poles and power lines everywhere, and it would just be a mess. And so, if the government gives a utility company permission to operate as a monopoly in a certain area, that company will be subject to strict regulation and monitoring of the rates they charge, their customers, and the timing of any rate increases. Another good example of this is pharmaceutical companies. They come up with a new drug, and they get it approved by the FDA, and that drug then becomes available on the market. So they get a patent on that particular drug, and it has a time limit. So while that patent is valid, they have the benefit of being the sole manufacturer, the sole producer for that drug. And another benefit of this is they while that patent is valid, other drug companies they do research, and they do their own development on that drug, because they know that patent is going to run out eventually, and they'll be able to reproduce that drug. And so the research that they do while the original patent is valid might improve upon that drug, or it might they might be able to come up with a way to manufacture that drug at a lower cost. So antitrust laws have three main components. There's three pieces of legislation that make up what we know as antitrust laws. The first was established in 1890, is referred to as the Sherman Act. There's a Federal Trade Commission Act, which was established in 1914. And there's also the Clayton Act, which was also established in 1914. So the goal of the Sherman Act was to preserve free competition as a rule of trade. It's designed to prevent unreasonable restraint of trade and/or monopolization. It explicitly prohibits the fixation of prices, division of markets, and the rigging of bids, which we'll talk a little bit about here in a minute. Penalties may be civil or criminal. However, criminal prosecutions are typically limited to intentional violations. And criminal penalties, or monetary fines, monetary fines for criminal penalties generally have a limit of $100 million for corporations and $1 million for individuals. So the Sherman Act consists of two sections. Section 1 states that every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy, in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is hereby declared to be illegal. It's considered a felony, and it's punishable by fine and/or imprisonment. So Section 1 is basically the actual act of two companies coming together in order to achieve a monopoly. So Section 2 states that every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or within foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony and is similarly punishable. So Section 2 addresses the actual attempt of an individual or a company to achieve a monopoly.